The bank branch on Passyunk Avenue was busier than usual that Thursday morning. The line stretched to the door, phones rang, printers hummed. In the middle of it all stood a small elderly woman at the service desk. Her hand closed tightly around a little brass key on a chain. The young teller looked down at her screen, then up again, her voice a little softer than usual. "Is anyone here with you today, ma'am?" The old woman glanced around the lobby. For one brief second, her smile went out. The teller didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. They both knew this was the 12th week. Behind her, a young woman waiting in line looked up. Marin Aldridge, 27, a 4th grade teacher. There every Thursday to hand over $60 in cash toward a debt she'd been paying down for 3 years and still hadn't cleared. She was the kind of person who always noticed when someone looked alone. Maybe because she'd lived in it too long herself. The old woman turned slowly. Their eyes met. She hesitated, then asked in the gentlest voice imaginable, "Young lady, could you be my granddaughter? Just for 5 minutes." Marin blinked. The old woman smiled, embarrassed. "Only until I sign this one form. I promise I won't trouble you after that." Marin looked at the 79-year-old stranger. There was nothing calculating in her eyes, only embarrassment and something that looked painfully close to loneliness. She smiled. "Okay." The old woman's face lit up like a child's. She turned back to the counter, her voice full of pride. "My granddaughter is here." The teller smiled warmly. Everything suddenly became easier. The old woman put pen to paper, and Marin noticed her hand was shaking so badly the signature was barely legible, but she signed it. After 12 weeks, she finally signed it. They handed her a receipt, and the key was activated. The teller asked if she'd like to go down to the vault and open the box now. The old woman looked at that key for a long time, then she put it in her purse. Another day. "Outside," Marin finally asked, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you really need me?" The old woman looked down at the purse in her hands, then quietly answered, "Some doors only open when people believe you aren't alone." She smiled again, but this time the smile couldn't quite hide what was sitting behind her eyes. Marin didn't ask anything more, and she had no idea that the old woman had been sitting in that bank lobby for 3 weeks straight, or that she hadn't chosen the wrong person at all. If this story touched your heart, leave a like so we know you're still listening. Share it with someone you haven't called in a while. They might be waiting for exactly 5 minutes of your time today. And subscribe to walk through more stories like this one with us. She tucked the receipt into her wallet, carefully zipped it shut, and then said she would take the bus home. Marin looked around. Across the street was an auto repair shop. Beside it, a dry cleaner that had been closed for years. And farther down, there was nothing but a row of low buildings. There was no shelter, no bench, no signpost anywhere. The nearest bus stop Marin knew of was all the way at the end of the avenue, at least a 15-minute walk from there. The old woman said it so lightly that Marin almost let it pass. "Almost. I'll walk with you." The old woman waved her hand. "I've troubled you enough already." "I know. I'm choosing to ignore that." The woman laughed, a short, unexpected laugh, the kind that came from someone who hadn't had anybody argue back in a very long time. "My brides used to do that too. They'd say, 'No need to fix anything else, ma'am,' and then come back the next day asking me to let the waist out another 3/4 of an inch." "You made wedding dresses?" 45 years. Marin turned to look at her. "How many dresses is 45 years? The woman slowed for half a step, then said she didn't count. At first she had, but by the 10th year she gave it up. She remembered faces, though. She remembered every one of them. She remembered which bride cried during her fitting, which one made her redo the dress 3 times because her mother didn't approve, which one came alone because there was no one left to bring with her. "I still remember the faces of my old students." "Then you understand." They crossed an intersection. The woman had some difficulty stepping down from the curb, and Marin reached out to steady her without even thinking. The woman took her hand. Her hand was small and dry, trembling ever so slightly. "You noticed, didn't you?" Marin didn't answer right away. "I saw it when you signed." The woman nodded. 4 years now. At first it only happened when I was tired. Then it started happening even when I was sitting still. I retired at 75, not because my eyesight failed me, but because I couldn't thread a needle anymore. She told it in the same calm voice someone might use to talk about the weather, and that calmness was exactly what made it feel so heavy. She walked in silence for a few steps, then asked, "What grade do you teach?" 4th. "What school?" "An elementary school in Kensington." The woman nodded slowly, as though the name told her something she chose not to say. "Do teachers make enough to live on these days?" Marin laughed. "Depends on the month." "I'm asking seriously." "So am I." She laughed again, then pointed ahead. "I think that place sells flowers. Do you like flowers?" The woman looked at her for another second, then allowed her to change the subject. She didn't ask again. But when they stopped at a crosswalk, her eyes dropped to Marin's shoes. They were brown leather shoes, the kind people wore to work every day, and the heels had worn down badly on one side, the kind of wear that came from walking a great deal. The woman said nothing. She only looked, then lifted her eyes and stared straight ahead. They kept walking. The woman talked about one thing after another, about the stray cat that liked to sleep on her front steps, about the 60-year-old neighbor who still believed he knew how to repair a roof, about the time she had made a wedding dress for a young woman who called off her wedding 3 days before the ceremony. Did she come pick up the dress? She did. She paid in full, thanked me, and took it home. You didn't ask her why? No, why not? Because when I looked at her face, I knew she had already asked herself enough questions. Marin heard that and suddenly understood why this old woman had chosen her out of everyone in that crowded bank lobby earlier, or at least she thought she understood. After about 10 minutes, the woman slowed considerably. Marin thought she was tired and started looking for somewhere they could sit. But the woman had already stopped in front of a small bakery wedged between 2 old storefronts. The glass window was fogged, and inside were several wooden tables and a pastry counter. The woman stood there studying the sign for quite a long time. Then she turned to Marin, and there was a light in her eyes that Marin would see many more times in the weeks ahead. The light of someone who had just thought of something and already knew, with absolute certainty, that she was going to get her way. I have an idea. She pushed the door open and went in first. And Marin realized the woman hadn't even asked whether she wanted to come inside. It was warm and quiet in there, with the steady hum of a coffee machine running behind the counter. She chose a table by the window, sat down, and immediately opened her wallet. Let me pay. No. Ma'am, you already bought me an entire morning. The woman looked at her. You stood beside me for 5 minutes, and you think that means you get to pay for my coffee? Marin was about to argue again, but the woman had already risen and walked straight to the counter without looking back once. She ordered 2 cups of coffee and an almond pastry, then asked for it to be cut in half and placed on 2 separate plates, then changed her mind and said to leave it whole, then changed her mind again. The young man behind the counter waited with remarkable patience. When she came back to the table, she said, "See? Men around here have better manners than the ones in my neighborhood." The 2 of them sat there for a while without talking about anything particularly important. She asked Marin what subject she taught most often, and Marin explained that she taught everything because in 4th grade one teacher handled all the subjects. The woman said, "So you have to be good at both math and reading?" Marin replied, "You're giving me too much credit. I only have to be better at it than 9-year-olds. The woman laughed and dropped a crumb of pastry onto the table. Then she pulled out her phone and placed it between them as though she were setting down something dangerous. "Do you know how to use this thing?" "I do." "Good. I want to make a video call to my grandson." Marin picked up the phone, and it took her a few seconds to understand what she was looking at. The screen was already open to a conversation. The last message had been sent 11 days earlier. It contained only one word. Yes. There was nothing above it, and nothing below it. Marin stared at it a little longer than necessary, then looked up and said nothing. "Here, ma'am. Hold it like this." The woman took the phone. The camera pointed straight at the ceiling. "Ma'am, you're calling the light fixture." She turned the phone around. Now the screen showed nothing but her chin. A little lower. She adjusted it. This time, the almond pastry appeared in perfect focus, filling the entire frame. Marin burst out laughing. "I've just been formally introduced to your pastry." The woman said she couldn't understand why people had to make a telephone so complicated. In the old days, if you wanted to call someone, you dialed the number, then you talked, then you hung up. Nobody had to learn anything. Marin took the phone, turned the camera the right way, and handed it back. The woman reached out one finger and tapped the screen. No call was made. Instead, inside the conversation with her grandson, a white cat wearing a flared dress suddenly appeared. It spun in a circle, jumped up on its hind legs, and above its head flashed the words, "Happy Birthday," in all 7 colors of the rainbow. The woman froze and stared. What did I just do? Marin leaned down to look at the screen, then had to put her coffee cup on the table, because she was laughing too hard to hold it. "You just wished your grandson a very enthusiastic happy birthday. It isn't his birthday." "I know." The woman let out an exaggerated sigh. "I'm 79 years old. I don't have the strength to fight a cat." 3 seconds later, the phone vibrated in her hand. A name appeared on the screen in capital letters. "Nicholas." She stared at it. She reached out one finger, then the screen went dark. "You hung up." "I hung up? You just rejected your grandson's call." She looked at the phone and pushed it a little farther away. "Well, then I hung up. Aren't you going to call him back? He worries too much." She said it quickly, too quickly, and Marin recognized it as the kind of sentence the woman had repeated so many times that she no longer had to think before saying it. "Besides," the woman said as she lifted her coffee, "I'm having coffee with my granddaughter." Marin shook her head. "I'm only your granddaughter until noon." The woman took a sip. "We'll see about that." They sat there a while longer. She asked Marin whether she planned to teach at that school forever, and Marin said she didn't know. She told her that 8 months earlier she had applied for an inter-school reading program in Charlotte. The program coordinated books and teachers across 14 schools at the same time, and she had spent 6 weeks preparing the application. And then what happened? They wrote back and said my application was very strong, but they had chosen someone else. She told the story lightly, in the voice of someone who had grown so accustomed to rejection that it no longer hurt, or someone who had learned how to speak about it as though it didn't. The woman set down her coffee. "Did you apply again?" "No." "Why not?" "Because I didn't want to write that application all over again." The woman nodded slowly, as though it were a perfectly reasonable answer that she had no intention of accepting. Then she looked out the window and said, "People have a way of coming back for the things they once passed over." Marin thought she was talking about her. It would be a long time before she understood that she wasn't. Outside, a black car moved slowly past the bakery, then stopped at the far end of the block. Nearly 5 kilometers away, in a conference room on the 16th floor, 9 men sat around a long table, and no one was speaking loudly. Nicholas Ranieri sat at the head of the table. He was 34 years old, dressed in a dark suit, and on his wrist was an old steel watch that looked completely out of place beside the price of that suit. In front of him lay the lease agreement for Pier Number 7, 40 pages thick, already read 3 times. Emil Vasco sat to his right, 58 years old, the only man in the room who dared interrupt him. He was saying that the board wouldn't like Clause 11. Nico said the board didn't need to like it. Emil said they had liked it for 40 years. Nico said exactly, and that was the problem. Someone in the room cleared his throat. No one said anything more. On the table, Nico's phone lit up. He didn't pick it up right away. He had a habit of never touching his phone while he was speaking to someone, a habit his grandmother had taught him when he was 12, and one he had kept ever since. He finished what he was saying before glancing down at the screen. A message from his grandmother. He opened it. On the screen was a white cat wearing a flared dress, spinning in circles, with the words, "Happy Birthday," flashing above its head in all 7 colors of the rainbow. Emil saw the look on his face and stopped talking. Nico pressed call. He put the phone to his ear. 1 ring, then silence. It hadn't rung out. The call had been ended. He stared at the phone in his hand. In 11 years, ever since the day he had gotten his own phone number, his grandmother had never once hung up on him. She answered while she was watering her plants. She answered when she was at the clinic. She answered at 11 o'clock at night, and the first thing she said was that she wasn't asleep. She was watching the news. Once, she answered in the middle of having the flu, her voice so hoarse that he had to listen twice before he understood what she was saying. She had never hung up on him. Nico stood. Everyone in the room stood with him. He told them to sit down, and they sat down. Emil asked where he was going. Nico didn't answer. He was already at the door. In the elevator, he called the first number. He gave the name of the bank branch on Passyunk Avenue, then said, "My grandmother." The person on the other end didn't ask a single question. The elevator doors opened onto the basement level. He called the second number as he walked toward his car. He said only 1 sentence, 7 words, and hung up. He had never repeated an order twice in his life. The car pulled out of the garage. His phone vibrated. He answered, said nothing, then ended the call. His grandmother had left the bank. She had left at 9:42. She was walking. His grip tightened around the steering wheel. His grandmother didn't walk. His grandmother was 79 years old and had a right knee that, according to her, either hurt or didn't hurt, depending entirely on what she wanted at the time. The phone vibrated a second time. He answered. This time, the person on the other end spoke a little longer. Nico asked exactly 1 question. Was she alone? The answer was no. Nico was silent for 3 seconds. Then he asked, "Who?" The person told him it was a young woman, somewhere between 25 and 30 years old, someone they didn't recognize. Nico changed lanes. He asked nothing else. Inside his head, everything was being rearranged with remarkable speed and cold precision. His grandmother never hung up on him. Today she had. His grandmother didn't walk. Today she was walking, and she was walking with someone nobody knew. He didn't think about the possibility that she was having coffee. He thought about other things, the things a man carrying the Ranieri name was forced to think about first. And that was the small tragedy of his life, that he had never spoken aloud to anyone. The phone vibrated a 3rd time. He answered. 30 seconds later, he ended the call and turned left. From the moment he had risen from the conference table until then, 7 minutes had passed. 7 minutes to learn where his grandmother was sitting, which bakery she was in, which table she had chosen, and what she was laughing about. No one inside that bakery had called him. No one at the bank had called him. He knew anyway. The car stopped 1 block from the bakery. Nico remained behind the wheel for several more seconds, looking through the misted glass of the shop window. His grandmother was sitting at the table beside the window. She was saying something. Then she tipped her head back and laughed. Nico sat completely still. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen her laugh like that. He searched his memory and still couldn't find it. And that was why he stayed in the car for another 3 minutes, before opening the door and stepping out. The bell above the bakery door gave a dry little chime. Maren looked up and saw a man walk in, and the first thing she noticed wasn't his suit or his build, but the way the entire bakery seemed to shift almost imperceptibly when he stepped through the door. The young man behind the counter stopped wiping a cup. A customer at the corner table looked up, then immediately lowered his eyes back to his newspaper. No one said anything. The man walked straight toward the table by the window, and Maren realized he hadn't looked around for anyone. He knew exactly where he was going. Nico stopped in front of his grandmother. He looked her over from head to toe, quickly, the way someone might inspect something to see whether anything had been damaged. Then he said, "You didn't answer your phone." She took a sip of coffee. "I was busy. You walked here from the bank. I like walking. This morning you said your knee hurt." She set down her cup. "Nico, you're standing there looking at me like I'm a broken car." Then she did something that caught him completely off guard. She pushed back her chair and stood, bracing one hand on the table, turned toward Maren, and announced in the same voice she had once used with brides 45 years ago, the kind of voice that allowed no argument, "This is my granddaughter." No one in the bakery said a word. Maren was holding her coffee cup, and she nearly dropped it onto the saucer. Nico looked at his grandmother, then at Maren, then back at his grandmother. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke very slowly, one word at a time, as though repeating a sentence he needed her to hear clearly. "My grandmother doesn't have a granddaughter." She picked up her fork and cut off a piece of almond pastry. "If you say so, then I suppose you know." Nico stood there for another 2 seconds, then turned to Maren and asked whether she could step outside and talk. It wasn't really a question. Maren stood. The old woman started to say something, but Maren gave her a small shake of the head, the kind that meant, "It's all right," and the woman sat back down, picked up her fork, and kept eating. Outside, the sun had begun to break through. Nico stood facing her with both hands in the pockets of his coat. "Who are you?" Maren gave him her name. He asked what she did. She said she was a teacher. He asked how long she had known his grandmother. Maren glanced at the watch on her wrist. About an hour and 40 minutes. Nico went silent. Then she told him everything. She started at the beginning, leaving nothing out and adding nothing. She told him about the long line at the bank, about the employee's question, about how she had been standing directly behind his grandmother and had seen the smile disappear from her face for a single second. She told him about the offer of 5 minutes. She told him about the signature trembling so badly that it was almost unreadable. She told him how his grandmother had said she would take the bus even though there wasn't a bus stop within a 15-minute walk. She told him how the woman had insisted on paying for the coffee. She told him about the ballet dancing cat. When she reached that part, she stopped and added, "That part was my fault. I handed the phone back to her a little too soon." Nico didn't interrupt her once. When she finished, he remained perfectly still. Maren watched his expression change 3 times in less than a minute. First came suspicion, the suspicion that had already been there before he ever entered the bakery. Then confusion, when he realized the story was too strange to be invented. Then something else, something he tried to hide but didn't hide quickly enough, and Maren recognized it as shame. He asked whether she wanted anything. "I don't understand. What do you want?" Maren looked at him. "I want to finish my coffee. It's getting cold." From inside the bakery, his grandmother's voice carried through the half-closed door, loud and clear. "I heard all of that. The girl hasn't quit yet." Nico closed his eyes for 1 second. "Were you listening in?" "I'm 79 years old. I hear selectively." Nico drove both of them home. He opened the front passenger door for his grandmother, the way he had done for the past 11 years, but she walked right past it and opened the back door instead. She always sat in the front. "My knee hurts today. This morning you said your shoulder hurt. The pain moves." She climbed into the back seat, settled herself comfortably, then pointed toward the front. "Don't leave my granddaughter standing there." Maren lowered her head to hide a smile and got into the front passenger seat. On the drive home, the old woman didn't allow either of them a moment of peace. She asked Maren how many years she had been teaching, how many children were in her class, and asked Nico why, at 34 years old, He still wore the exact same serious expression he had worn when he was 12. Nico said she was bothering their guest. She said she was getting acquainted with family. The car stopped at a red light. Maren happened to glance into the rearview mirror. Directly behind them was a black car. 2 men were inside. One of them looked straight into the mirror and gave a small nod. Maren turned her head. Nico was looking into the mirror too. He nodded back. Just once, barely noticeable, and then it was over. The light turned green. The car moved on. Maren sat very still and looked out the window. And something inside her chest had suddenly gone very cold. She had seen that black car before. It had moved slowly past the bakery while the old woman was talking about the things people passed over. And before that, earlier that morning, while Maren had still been standing in line at the bank, she remembered looking through the glass and seeing a black car parked across the street. 3 days later, Maren's phone rang at 8:15 on Saturday morning. Unknown number. She answered in a voice still thick with sleep. "Good morning, granddaughter." Maren sat bolt upright in bed. "Ma'am, how did you get my number?" "You wrote it on that piece of paper at the bakery. I wrote it down for the employee so I could get a discount coupon." "Well, I was there too." Maren stared up at the ceiling. "What do you need?" "I need someone honest." Her heart beat a little faster. "What happened?" "I'm choosing tomatoes." Silence. "Tomatoes? This supermarket has 6 kinds. 6 kinds, child. Every one of them looks suspicious." Maren collapsed back onto her pillow. "Where's your grandson?" "He's working." "Did you call him?" "I did. He sent me an app for ordering groceries." The woman's voice sounded as though she had been deeply insulted. "He told me I could press a button, and someone would bring everything straight to my door." "That does sound convenient. Machines aren't allowed to choose tomatoes." 20 minutes later, Maren was standing in the produce section explaining to a 79-year-old woman that Roma tomatoes were meatier and better for making sauce. Vine-ripened tomatoes were sweeter and better eaten raw, and those large, dark red ones were juicier and better for slicing. The woman listened with great concentration, nodded exactly where nodding seemed appropriate, asked 2 questions, then reached over and picked up a container of cherry tomatoes. "Ma'am, those are the 4th kind." "I know. Then why did you ask me?" "I like having options. It should have been nothing more than one Saturday morning." But it didn't stop there. The following Tuesday, she called because her television remote wasn't working. She said she had already replaced the batteries, but it still wouldn't turn on. Maren drove over, picked up the remote, opened the back cover, and found both batteries inserted backward. She turned them around. The television came on immediately. The woman looked at the screen, then at Maren. "I spent my entire life holding needles thinner than a strand of hair, and I can't put in 2 batteries?" She argued that the symbols inside the battery compartment were printed far too small, then added that whoever had designed the thing had clearly never had a grandmother. Then came Saturday evening, when Nico announced that he was going to cook dinner. His grandmother was sitting in her armchair. She said nothing for 3 seconds, then turned to Maren and whispered, "Order pizza right now." Nico said he had watched 4 instructional videos. She asked how long those 4 videos were. He said 22 minutes altogether. She said she had spent 14 years learning how to cook and still burned a pot once a month. He told her to stay right where she was. He wouldn't allow anyone into the kitchen. For the first 40 minutes or so, nothing but very confident sounds came from the kitchen. The steady tapping of a knife against a cutting board, running water, the oven door closing with a firm, decisive click. At one point, Maren even heard him whistling. His grandmother sat listening with the expression of someone waiting for something very specific to happen. Then the sounds became less frequent. Then they stopped completely. The silence lasted just a little too long. She put down her magazine. There it is. 3 seconds later, smoke poured out through the kitchen doorway. Maren ran in. Nico was standing in front of the roasting pan, still wearing both oven mitts, staring down at the chicken with the expression of a man who had just been betrayed. The chicken was black from one end to the other. Not scorched. Black. Nico said it had looked much easier in the video. His grandmother came in leaning on her cane, stopped 1 step away from the pan, and examined the chicken with complete seriousness. She tilted her head to the left, then to the right. Then she walked around to the other side of the table and looked at it from behind. Nico waited. She folded her arms. 2 out of 10. Maren said, "I'd give it a 3. The woman turned toward her. 3? "Yes." She raised an eyebrow. "The extra point is because the kitchen survived." The moment Maren said it, the woman burst out laughing. She truly laughed, loudly, so hard that she had to brace one hand against the back of a chair, and Nico stood there with the oven mitts still on his hands, watching her laugh, and then he began laughing too. He laughed like someone who hadn't done it in a very long time and had forgotten exactly how. Awkward at first, but he laughed. Marin opened the window to let the smoke out, and she was laughing too. The three of them stood in a smoke-filled kitchen in South Philadelphia, laughing over a burned chicken, and none of them noticed that it was the first time in many years that the house had held the sound of 3 people laughing at once. The pizza arrived 20 minutes later. No one complained about a thing. The chicken was wrapped up and thrown into the trash, and before the lid came down, his grandmother gave it one final look and said she was lowering the score to 1.5. That evening, when Marin was leaving, the woman walked her all the way to the door. She stood on the front step, with one hand resting against the door frame, and said, "I'm busy next Thursday. I won't be able to call you." Marin asked, "What are you busy with?" The woman said, "I have something to do." Then she closed the door. The whole business of her insisting on visiting the classroom began with an offhand remark. Marin mentioned that her class had an afternoon reading lesson that Wednesday, and the woman immediately asked what time. Marin said, "I'm only telling you about it." The woman said she knew, then asked again what time. At 2 o'clock on Wednesday afternoon, she was standing at the door of the 4th grade classroom wearing her nicest wool coat and carrying a box of cookies from a shop near the school. Marin introduced her as a friend. 22 children turned around to look at her all at once. She sat down in the chair Marin had prepared for her at the back of the classroom, placed the box of cookies on her lap, and for about 3 minutes she sat perfectly still. Then Marin opened the book and asked the class whether anyone knew what kind of animals had lived on Earth before human beings existed. She hadn't even finished the question when a hand shot up from the second desk. Milo Bracken, 9 years old, had his arm raised straight into the air and was already halfway out of his seat. Marin called on him. Milo said, "Dinosaurs," then continued without taking a breath, "But there's something our book gets wrong." Marin asked what it got wrong. Milo turned all the way around toward the back of the classroom, where the woman was sitting, as though he had already decided she was the person who truly needed to hear this. Tyrannosaurus rex had feathers. In the book, they draw it smooth like a lizard, but that's wrong. They found fossils. It really had feathers, at least around the neck and along the back. He said it all in one rush, very quickly and with complete certainty. The woman nodded thoughtfully. She nodded like someone who had known this for years, and was pleased that somebody had finally said it out loud. She said she thought so too. Milo's whole face lit up. "You knew that too?" she said. "I've been alive for 79 years. I know a lot of things." The whole class laughed. Milo didn't. He hurried back to his desk, pulled a stack of papers out of his backpack, fastened together with 3 staples, then carried it to the back of the room and handed it to her with both hands. "I'm writing a book." She accepted it. The book was 4 pages long. On the cover was a green dinosaur with 3 feathers sticking out from the back of its neck. She turned each page slowly, actually reading it, instead of merely glancing through it. Milo stood beside her with his hands clasped together, waiting. She finished the whole thing, closed it, and said, "You write very well." Milo asked, "Really?" She said, "Really, but the ending isn't good enough." The entire classroom went quiet. Milo asked, "Why not?" She said, "At the end of your story, the dinosaur finishes eating and goes to sleep." Milo said, "Well, it gets sleepy after it eats." She said, "I understand, but the reader isn't sleepy. The reader is still waiting to see what happens next. You need to leave them with something on the final page. A strange sound, a shadow, another dinosaur just arriving." Milo stood there, thinking for several seconds, then said, "I know. I'll make another one appear right there. Then the page ends. Then I'll write part 2. She said, "There, now you're a writer." The class laughed again, and Milo ran back to his seat, telling the child beside him as he went that he was going to write part 2. While the children worked, the woman sat quietly at the back of the classroom and looked around. She looked at the bookshelf against the wall on the left. It had 4 shelves. The top shelf held 9 books. The second had a few more books and a cardboard box. The bottom 2 shelves were completely empty. She looked at it for a long time. Then she turned her eyes toward the plastic container on the teacher's desk, where there was a handful of pencils and pens in different colors and styles, clearly bought one at a time, from different places at different times. One child raised a hand and asked for a pencil. Marin took one out and handed it over, saying, "Be careful with this one, all right?" The child said, "Yes, ma'am." The woman watched the whole thing. She didn't say a word. When the lesson ended, the children poured out of the room, and several of them ran over to say goodbye to her before heading through the door. Milo was the last one. He turned back and asked, "Will you come again next time?" She said, "That depends on whether part 2 is any good." On the drive home, Marin thanked her while she drove. "Thank you for coming. The kids really liked you," the woman said, Fourth graders all think they're smarter than the textbook. Marin laughed. Some of them are. She said, I know. Then she fell silent. Marin glanced over. The woman had taken out her phone and was typing very slowly, one letter at a time, the way someone types when they have to look at the keyboard. She kept at it for quite a while. Marin asked, Who are you texting? The woman didn't answer right away. She read the message through once, sent it, then turned the screen face down and slipped the phone into the pocket of her coat. She said, Turn left at that light. This road gets backed up around this time. Marin turned left. The woman looked out the window for the rest of the drive and never mentioned the message again. The call came on Monday evening. She didn't waste time. Are you free Wednesday morning? Marin said, I teach until 3 o'clock. The woman said, Then never mind. It's all right. I'll go by myself. Marin sat up straighter. Where are you going? My regular checkup. Once every 3 months. Nothing unusual. I can rearrange things. I'll ask Miss Delaney to watch my class for 1 period. The woman told her not to bother anyone. Marin said, Ma'am, can I ask you something? Why don't you ask your grandson? The woman was silent for about 2 seconds. Nico has a meeting. She said it jokingly. It truly sounded like a joke, even with that little lift at the end of the sentence, as though it were a funny story she had told many times before. But Marin was accustomed to listening for what lived underneath other people's voices, and she heard it immediately. I'll take you. At 8:30 Wednesday morning, Marin parked in front of the clinic. The woman was wearing her finest wool coat and carrying a small cloth bag containing her medical record book and 2 boxes of medication. While they waited for her turn, she told Marin that when this doctor was young, he had once come to her shop to have his wife's wedding dress altered, and she said she had been forced to let out the waist 3 times because the woman had lied about her measurements. Marin laughed. The woman said, Don't laugh. Every woman lies about that measurement. I did this for 45 years. I know. When her turn came, Marin intended to remain in the hallway, but the woman caught her by the hand. You're coming in with me. The doctor asked the usual questions. He checked her blood pressure twice, once while she was sitting, and once just after she stood up. He made notes. He asked whether she ever felt dizzy when she got to her feet. She said, At my age, who doesn't get dizzy standing up? He asked again, more slowly this time, and she admitted, Sometimes. He wrote something else down. He told her to drink enough water, rise slowly, not bend down and then straighten up too suddenly, and most importantly, not to garden alone at midday. She said she heard him. He said, You said that last time. She replied, Then your memory is better than I thought. When they were finished, the 2 of them stepped back into the hallway. Marin was carrying the bag of medicine when the elevator doors opened, and Nico stepped out. His tie was crooked to one side. He was breathing like a man who had just run up from the parking garage and was trying very hard to look as though he hadn't. He glanced around, saw them, and walked quickly over. Are you done? Marin said. Yes. He told his grandmother he was sorry. The meeting ran longer than expected. I told them I had to leave at 9 o'clock. She waved a hand. It's fine. Then she continued, still smiling. Meetings always run long. They always do. There wasn't a single word of accusation in the sentence. No sharpness in her voice. She said it exactly the way someone might comment on the weather, and that was precisely what made it heavy. Marin saw Nico go still for half a second. He opened his mouth as though he meant to say something, then stopped. He reached out and took the cloth bag from his grandmother's hand. She gave it to him. The hallway stayed quiet for exactly 3 seconds, and Marin decided 3 seconds was enough. Good news. They both turned toward her. The doctor says she's healthier than her temper. The woman immediately straightened her back. My temper is perfectly good, Nico said quietly. You once chased a roofer out of the yard with a garden hose, she said. He quoted me twice the proper price, Nico said. He quoted you twice the price because you made him climb up and down 4 times to check again. Marin burst out laughing. The woman turned toward her and said, Don't listen to him. But the corners of her mouth were already curving upward. She walked ahead toward the elevator, leaning on her cane, her back straight, and while they waited for the doors to open, Nico remained half a step behind. He said softly to Marin, Thank you for bringing her. Marin said, It was nothing. He said, I meant to come. I told my assistant to keep my schedule clear from 8:30. Marin looked at him. There were many things she could have said then. She had said similar things to plenty of parents before, sentences that began with, you know, and ended with advice nobody wanted to hear. But she didn't say any of them. She only said, She told me about letting out the waist of the doctor's wife's wedding dress 3 times. She told me the whole story while we were waiting. She told someone. Nico looked at her. Then he gave one very small nod and followed his grandmother into the elevator. On the way out to the parking lot, The woman walked between them. When they reached the turn, she stopped, looked at Nico, and asked, "Are you busy at lunch today?" He said, "I have something at 11 o'clock." She said, "All right then," and she kept walking. Nico stayed still for exactly 1 beat before saying, "I'll cancel it." She didn't turn around, but her pace slowed noticeably, and Marin saw her tighten her grip around the strap of the bag in her hand. Lunch that day was at a small Italian restaurant 3 blocks from the clinic, and she was the one who chose the table. The waiter led them toward a round table against the wall, but she shook her head and pointed instead to the square table in the middle of the room. She sat down at the head of the table before either of them had time to react, then pointed. "Nico sits here. Marin sits there." Those 2 seats were directly across from each other. No one thought there was anything unusual about it. The waiter handed out the menus, and she immediately began asking Marin one question after another. "Can you eat seafood? How much spice can you handle? What food did you hate most when you were little?" Marin answered each question, and every time she did, the woman leaned slightly to one side and said, "Speak a little louder, child. My hearing hasn't been very good lately." Marin moved her chair closer. The woman still leaned. She told Nico, "Can you hear her? Repeat that for me." Nico repeated it. She said, "You're speaking too softly." He moved his chair closer. After about 10 minutes, the 2 of them were sitting considerably nearer to each other than they had been at the beginning, while the woman leaned back in her chair with the expression of someone who had just completed exactly what she had set out to do. The food arrived. The conversation wandered from one subject to another. Marin said the coffee at the shop on the corner was terrible. Nico said it was the best coffee shop in the neighborhood, and Marin said in that case, the entire neighborhood had a problem. The woman didn't join in. She simply ate and watched. Then they started arguing about pineapple on pizza. Marin said pineapple belonged on pizza. Nico put down his fork. "Say that again." She said it again. He stared at her as though she had just personally insulted him, and his grandmother nearly choked on her water. The waiter brought dessert and asked who had ordered the chestnut cream cake. The woman immediately raised her hand and said, "Mine," from the head of the table, nearly 3 meters away from the waiter, while music was playing and conversations filled the restaurant around them. Marin turned and stared at her. The woman pretended not to notice. "Ma'am." "What?" "You heard him from all the way over there." She picked up her fork. "I can hear cake." Marin laughed so hard she had to cover her face with her hands. Nico was laughing too, trying to hide it by drinking water, without much success. In the middle of all that, Marin's phone vibrated in her pocket. She took it out and looked. A message had just arrived. Inside it was an animated picture of a white cat in a flared dress, the same cat from before, spinning in circles. She looked at the sender's name. On the screen were the words, "Favorite Granddaughter." Marin looked up. The woman was sitting exactly 1 meter away from her, fork in hand, eyes fixed calmly on her dessert plate. "Ma'am." "What? Did you just text me?" "Yes. You're sitting right next to me." "I know." Marin turned the screen toward her. "You saved my name as favorite granddaughter?" The woman glanced over and nodded. "It's shorter. You don't have any other granddaughters?" "Exactly. No competition." Nico set down his water glass. He didn't say anything, but Marin happened to glance at him and noticed that both of his ears had turned red. She looked for another second to make sure. They were definitely red. "Nico." "What? Are you jealous?" "No," he answered too quickly. So quickly that even he seemed to hear it. He said, "I'm not competing with anyone for my grandmother." Without looking up, the woman took a sip of coffee. "You should be jealous." Marin laughed until tears came to her eyes and had to wipe them away with a napkin. Nico stared at his grandmother for a long moment, then shook his head and picked up his fork again, the corner of his mouth lifting in a smile he couldn't quite hide. After that day, everything became more regular. Marin stopped asking whether the woman needed anything. She simply came by. Nico began coming home earlier, on days when he didn't have a flight scheduled. Some weeks, the 3 of them ate dinner together twice. Then, one Friday afternoon, Marin was sitting at the kitchen table, grading her students' papers, when the woman stood up, poured a cup of coffee, added 2 spoonfuls of sugar without asking anyone, then carried it toward the front door. Marin heard the door open. She looked up and peered through the narrow window beside it. The woman stepped onto the porch, bent down, and placed the cup of coffee on the top step, right near the edge, beneath the covered part of the porch. She didn't look toward the street. She didn't wave to anyone. She straightened up, brushed off her hands, then came back inside and closed the door. Marin waited until she returned to the kitchen table before asking, "Ma'am, who was that coffee for?" The woman pulled out her chair and sat down. "For the person outside." Marin looked through the window. The porch was empty. The street was empty. There was a car parked across the road, but there were always cars parked in this neighborhood. What person? The woman reached for the stack of papers on the table and began flipping through them, pretending to be curious. These children have terrible handwriting. Ma'am, how long does it take you to grade all these? Ma'am, she put the paper down and looked at Marin, and there was something in her eyes like a person quietly but firmly closing a door. You're staying for dinner, aren't you? Marin looked at her for another moment, then said, Yes. Throughout dinner, the woman never mentioned it again. At 9 o'clock, when Marin left, she crossed the porch and glanced down at the step. The cup was still there. It was empty. He found out about it on a Tuesday night, and he found out in the simplest way possible. His grandmother called Marin at 9 o'clock that evening to ask about something trivial, and Marin said, I'm at work. I'll call you back later. She hung up, then turned to Nico, who was sitting at the kitchen table, and said, That girl is working at this hour? Nico didn't say anything, but at 10 o'clock that night, his car stopped outside a laundromat on a street corner about 4 blocks from Marin's school. Inside, harsh white lights glowed overhead. There were 6 washing machines and 4 dryers, 3 of them running. Marin was sitting behind the counter with a stack of her students' notebooks in front of her and a red pen in her hand. He didn't go in right away. He sat in the car for about 10 minutes, watching through the glass, and he counted 3 times when she got up to take clothes out of a dryer and fold them for a customer, and all 3 times she returned to the table and resumed grading from exactly where she had stopped. Then he opened the car door. The bell over the laundromat entrance rang. Marin looked up, and for 2 seconds, she froze. What are you doing here? He said. I was passing by. She looked through the glass at the deserted Kensington Street at 10 o'clock at night, then looked back at him. You were passing by? He pulled out the plastic chair in the corner and sat down. I was passing by. She didn't tell him to leave. She didn't say anything else either. She lowered her head and went back to grading, and he sat there in that brightly lit laundromat, surrounded by the steady turning sound of dryers, a man in a suit sitting on a plastic chair at 10 o'clock at night without saying a word. At 11 o'clock, an older woman came in to collect her laundry. By midnight, only 2 machines were still running. Marin finished grading the stack of notebooks, stood up, went to the machine in the corner, brought back 2 cups of water, handed him one, then sat down on the plastic chair beside him. 3 shifts a week, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, from 7 o'clock at night until 2 o'clock in the morning. He asked when she slept. She said she got enough sleep. He didn't ask again. They sat quietly for a long time. The dryers turned in a slow, steady rhythm, almost soothing. Then Marin began speaking, even though no one had asked her anything. My younger brother's name was Wyatt. Nico turned toward her. He was 8 years younger than me. Our parents died when I was 12, and he was only 4. Then we were separated, and when I was 19, I finally got custody of him. He passed away 8 years ago, when he was just 11. After she said it, she took a breath and kept going. But her voice had changed completely. There was exactly one book he loved. Just one. It was about a turtle that got lost. I read it to him 41 times. I counted. She smiled. Every time I read it, he laughed, because I was terrible at doing the characters' voices. I gave the turtle a deep voice and the bird a high one, and he'd say, "Sis, your bird sounds like a kettle boiling." Then I'd read it again, and he'd laugh again, and he'd make me read it one more time. She stopped. Then she said, "That's all." She took a sip of water and didn't say anything more about Wyatt. Nico didn't ask. He wanted to. He had at least 5 questions in his head, and he swallowed every one of them. He just sat there. After a while, he asked how much debt was left. She said, 31,000. He said, "I'll pay it." Marin turned to look at him. He continued, his voice as ordinary as if they were discussing the price of gasoline. "I'll pay all of it this week." She said no. He said, "Listen to me first." She said, "No." He went quiet. Marin set her cup of water on the floor and turned fully toward him, and for the first time since they had known each other, there wasn't even a trace of humor in her voice. "You listen to me. For the past 3 years, every Thursday I've taken $60 in cash to that bank. I stand in line. I make the payment. I take the receipt home, and I put it in a box. That box is full now," she continued. "That money is the only thing left between me and that little boy. Every time I make a payment, it means I'm still doing something for him. If you pay it all off in one afternoon, what do I have left? I'm paying every dollar myself. You don't get to take that away from me." By then, the only sound left in the laundromat was a single dryer finishing its final cycle. Nico sat there for a very long time without speaking. In his entire life, no one had ever refused his money. People took his money wearing every kind of expression: gratitude, fear, calculation, but they took it. This was the first time anyone had said no, and what surprised him most wasn't that she had refused. What surprised him most was how relieved he felt. He nodded. "I understand," she said. "Thank you," he said. "If I can't help, then I'll sit here until 2 o'clock, she started to say. "You don't have to." Then she stopped herself. She only said, "All right." At 2 o'clock in the morning, she pulled down the metal shutter and locked it. He walked with her to her car at the end of the street without saying anything the entire way. When they reached it, she opened the car door, then turned back. "Nico." "What?" "Don't tell your grandmother that I work here," Nico said. "I won't." He kept his word, but 3 days later, his grandmother called him and asked, "Did you know that girl works night shifts 3 times a week?" He said, "You knew?" She said, "I knew by the 2nd week." Then she hung up. Maren began to notice it gradually, not all in one day. The woman called her on Monday, Tuesday, Friday, some weeks even on Sunday, but never on Thursday. Once, Maren called her first on a Thursday morning and she didn't answer, then called back around noon and said she had been busy. Another time, Maren stopped by the house at 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning and found the door locked and the lights off. She stood on the porch, looking at the empty coffee cup sitting on the step. And she remembered one detail, the small brass key hanging from the necklace. The woman always wore it beneath her clothes, close against her chest, and whenever she came home from somewhere on a Thursday afternoon, she had a habit of lifting one hand to touch the collar of her blouse, as though checking to make sure it was still there. The following Thursday, Maren asked to be excused from the final lesson of the morning. She told Miss Delaney she had a family matter to take care of, and she realized she had just lied without feeling that it was a lie at all. At 11:15, she parked about half a block from the bank branch on Passyunk Avenue. She sat in the car. At exactly 11 o'clock, the woman appeared at the corner, walking with her cane and wearing her finest wool coat. She went into the bank. Maren got out of the car and crossed to the other side of the street, where there was a lamppost, and watched through the large glass windows. The woman didn't get in line. She walked straight to the row of chairs in the waiting area and sat down. A little while later, the young employee from before came out carrying 2 cups of water and sat in the chair beside her. The two of them talked. Maren couldn't hear anything, but she saw the woman point toward the ceiling and make a motion as though brushing something from her shoulder, and the employee nodded and laughed. They were talking about the rain. Then the employee took out her phone and showed her a picture of something, and the woman leaned closer to look, then said something that made the young woman laugh out loud. 15 minutes. Maren checked her watch twice to make sure. Exactly 15 minutes. Then the woman stood up. She patted the employee lightly on the hand. She waved goodbye to someone else behind the counter. Then she walked toward the door. She didn't go downstairs. She didn't approach a teller. She didn't withdraw a single cent or hand over a single piece of paper. She simply sat there for 15 minutes and then left. Maren waited for her outside. When the woman pushed open the door and saw her, she stopped. For 1 second, Maren saw something on her face she had never seen before. Not anger, the look of someone who had been caught. "What are you doing here?" "I was going to ask you the same thing." The woman stood there gripping the strap of her bag. "Were you following me?" "I was passing by." The woman looked at her. Then she let out a breath and said, "That sounds strangely familiar." They walked to the stone bench near the bus stop, and the woman sat down first. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she reached beneath the collar of her blouse and pulled out the necklace. The small brass key rested in her palm. "It isn't mine." Maren stayed silent. "It's the key to safe deposit box number 214. The box is in my son's name. I'm only the joint holder," she continued, speaking very slowly, as though each word had to be lifted from somewhere deep inside her. "My son died in 2003. There was a warehouse fire. That was all she said about it. Nothing more." She sat staring down at her hand. "To get access to the box, I have to file paperwork transferring the rights to the surviving joint holder. It's only one form. I went to get that form when Nico turned 18. It's been sitting in a drawer in my house for 16 years. Maren could hear her own heartbeat. "You only have to sign it?" The woman nodded. "I only have to sign it." She was quiet for a long time. "Signing it means admitting that my son is truly dead, child." A car passed along the road. She waited until it was gone before continuing. "For 11 weeks in a row, I came here. Every week someone asked me, 'Did anyone come with you today?' Every week I said, 'My grandson is coming to sign with me. He'll come next week.' I lied 11 times, child. Nico doesn't even know the box exists. I've never told him." Maren asked, "What about today?" "Today I had no business here at all. I only came to sit." She looked toward the bank doors. "People think I come here because of money. There isn't any money in there, child. Not a single dollar. I come because down in that basement there is still something that belonged to my son. It's the only place left in this world where I can sit close to him." She stopped. "And because during the 15 minutes I sit here, someone knows my name. Someone asks how my knee has been. Someone notices if I miss a Thursday." Maren couldn't say anything. She sat there thinking about that first morning, about the question of 5 minutes, and she understood that the woman had never needed someone to sign any paperwork. She needed the whole world to believe there was someone who would notice whether she made it home. Maren slipped her hand through the crook of the woman's arm. "There is now." The woman took her hand. After a while, Maren asked softly, "What's inside the box?" The woman looked at the key resting in her palm. "I know there's an envelope. I've never opened it." They sat on that stone bench for a while longer, and then she said she was cold, so the two of them walked back to her house. She heated water, made tea, and did it all very slowly, more slowly than necessary, as though she already knew there was another question waiting for her. Maren sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around the warm cup, and she let the silence remain for about 5 minutes. Then she asked, "Ma'am, can I ask you one more question?" She said yes. The bank was crowded that day. The line stretched almost all the way to the door. There were 4 or 5 people behind me, and there was even a younger woman standing right beside me. The woman said nothing. "Why did you turn to me?" She picked up her cup of tea. She didn't drink from it. She simply held it there and remained quiet for a long time, long enough that Maren thought she was going to change the subject the way she always did whenever someone touched the exact place she didn't want touched. But she didn't. She set the cup back on the table. "Do you know what time I used to go to that bank?" Maren shook her head. 9 o'clock in the morning. For years, every Thursday, I went at 9 o'clock. It was quiet at 9. I could sit there in peace. Delia opened her counter at 8:30, and I was usually the second or third person through the door. She paused, but 3 weeks before that day I changed my time. Maren looked up. I started going at 11 o'clock. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen. Somewhere outside, someone called a child into the house. Maren sat very still, and she felt something slowly sliding into place inside her mind, and she didn't want it to. 11 o'clock on Thursdays. She heard herself say it. "That's when I come in to make my payment." The woman nodded. "I know." Maren set down her tea. She straightened in her chair and tried to remember. And then she did. She truly remembered. 3 weeks earlier, she had been standing in line, and there had been an elderly woman sitting in the waiting area with her hands folded in her lap. 2 weeks earlier, the same woman had been there, in the same place, talking to someone. The week before that, Maren couldn't clearly remember the face, but she remembered a gray wool coat sitting there. She had walked past the woman 3 times. 3 times, without ever really looking. "I've seen you before," the woman said. "Yes." 3 times. "Yes." Maren looked at her and didn't know exactly what she was feeling. "Why did you choose me?" The woman turned her cup slowly in a circle on the table. "Because in that bank, you were the only person who called the employee by her name." Maren didn't understand at first. The woman continued. "People walk in, hand over their papers, stare down at the keypad while they wait, then take their receipt and leave. Everyone does it. I've sat there for years and watched them. No one ever looks Delia in the face." She looked at Maren. "But you asked whether her daughter's cough had gotten any better." Maren went silent. "You asked again the following week, and you remembered the little girl's name. Delia told you her name was Ruby, and you remembered it correctly." The woman lifted a hand to touch the collar of her blouse where the necklace rested beneath it. "An old habit. That was when I thought, someone who notices other people that carefully probably won't refuse an old woman." The kitchen stayed silent for a long time. Maren sat there with both hands resting on the table, replaying that entire morning in her mind from the beginning, and everything had changed color. The question about 5 minutes hadn't been a desperate question that escaped in a moment of confusion. It had been the question of someone who had sat there for 3 weeks waiting for exactly one person. The woman looked at her, and for the first time in all the months they had known each other, Maren saw that she seemed a little worried. "Are you angry with me?" Maren shook her head. She truly meant it. It wasn't a polite gesture. "No." The woman didn't believe her. "I mean it." Maren lifted her eyes and looked at her. "I'm just thinking that you sat in that lobby for 3 weeks, looking for a kind person. You weren't looking for someone rich, or someone with connections, or someone who could help you with paperwork. You were looking for someone kind." The woman said nothing. Maren continued, her voice softer now. "I just wish you hadn't had to sit there so long." The woman turned her face away. She reached for the cloth used to wipe the table, and began rubbing at a spot that was already perfectly clean, wiping it for quite a while. Then she put the cloth down, picked up her tea, and took a sip. Maren left her alone for a moment. Then she asked again, and this time the familiar teasing note had returned to her voice. "Ma'am." "What? Is there anything else you're arranging behind everyone's back?" The woman was drinking her tea. She finished the sip, set the cup down, and adjusted the handle until it was facing exactly the right direction. Then she looked out the window. "It's going to rain, child. You should head home early before the traffic gets bad." The library came to the school on a Monday morning without warning. The principal stood in the teacher's lounge and announced that the school had just received an anonymous donation. 400 books, 6 new shelves, and enough money to repair the heating system in 2 classrooms. She said, "We don't know who the donor is. They didn't leave a name. They asked for only one thing, that the books arrive before the end of the month." Applause broke out in the teacher's lounge. One of the teachers cried. Marin sat at the back of the room and clapped too, and a thought flashed through her mind and disappeared so quickly that she didn't have time to hold on to it. By Wednesday, the books were already on the shelves. By Friday, the children were fighting over seats in the library. During recess that day, Marin was standing in the schoolyard supervising the students when Milo came running toward her at full speed, stopped in front of her, and had to take 2 breaths before he could speak. "Miss. Marin, miss." "Marin, I've already read 3 books." Marin laughed. 3 books in 4 days? "Yes. There's one about dinosaurs that's really thick, thicker than the math book, and it has real photographs, not drawings." He rushed through everything about the book, about how it said dinosaurs had feathers just like he had told them, and then he said, "I was right, miss. Marin, I'm going to bring it down and show the old lady." Marin said, "She'll love that." Milo nodded eagerly. Then he turned to run off, made it 2 steps, turned back, and added one more sentence with the innocence of someone talking about lunch. "My dad says these books came from the Ranieri family." Marin went still. "My dad works at the port. He says everybody knows that family." Then Milo ran off to play again, disappearing into the crowd of children in the yard, completely unaware of what he had just said. Marin stood there in the middle of the schoolyard. The children's voices, the whistle from the playground supervisor, the sound of a ball hitting the wall. She heard all of it and heard nothing at all. That evening, she drove to his house. He opened the door, took one look at her face, and knew. He didn't ask what was wrong. He simply stepped aside to let her in. She didn't move. She stood on the threshold. "What is your full name?" "Nicholas Ranieri." "Who are the Ranieris?" He was silent for 2 seconds. Then he said, "Come inside. It's cold out there." She said, "I'm asking you one question." He said, "I'll answer all of them, but come inside first." She went in. He didn't offer her a seat because he knew she wouldn't take one. He stood across from her, and then he told her, without denying a single word, "You heard correctly. My family does the things you're thinking about right now. Not all of them, and not everything people say, but most of it is true." Marin could hear her own heartbeat. "How long were you planning to hide it from me?" He said, "I wasn't planning to lie to you." Then he continued more slowly, "I was only trying to delay the day you asked, because every week that passed without you asking was another week my grandmother got to have you in her house." Marin turned her face away. She took 2 steps toward the window, then turned back. "What are you doing now?" he said. "For the past 3 years, I've been dismantling it, piece by piece. I've moved most of it into port operations and real estate, the parts with paperwork, taxes, inspections." She asked, "Then why don't you just stop today?" He said, "Because I can't stop it in one day. 200 people are being paid from the parts I haven't finished dismantling yet. If I pull everything apart too quickly, they'll lose their jobs within a week, and half of them will go looking for work somewhere much worse than anything I run." She said, "That's an excuse." He said, "Maybe." He said it so calmly that the calmness irritated her more than anything else. Then he added, and this time his voice was different, "There's something else. The price of walking away from that world was decided long before I ever tried. Nobody gets out without paying. I'm gathering enough to pay it." Marin asked, "How much?" He said, "You don't need to know." She looked at him for a long time. Then she asked the question she had been carrying in her chest since that afternoon. "What about my school?" He didn't avoid it. "My grandmother told me your classroom didn't have enough books. She told me there was a child who had to borrow a pencil." I didn't ask another question. She said, "You used your money." He said, "I used money from the foundation, and that foundation is clean. I can show you every piece of paperwork right now." She said, "The paperwork isn't the problem." He said, "I know." The room stayed silent for a long time. Marin stood there thinking about 400 books, about the bookshelf whose bottom 2 shelves had stood empty for 3 years, about Milo running across the schoolyard at full speed with a dinosaur book in his hands. She thought about the fact that she couldn't give those books back, and that she didn't want to give them back, and that was the part that made it hard to breathe. She said, "I'm going home." He didn't try to stop her. He walked over and opened the door for her. At the threshold, she stopped. She didn't turn around. She said only one sentence, "Don't have anyone follow me anymore." Then she left. The next morning, Nico called 2 people, and he said exactly one sentence to each of them, "Pull everyone out." Neither of them asked a single question. By noon, there was no longer a car parked at the end of the street where Marin lived. No one standing on the corner across from the elementary school at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. No one recording what time she left the laundromat. He kept his word exactly, and he discovered that keeping his word was far harder than he had imagined. The first day, he managed. On the second day, he started looking at his phone. By the 4th day, he realized he was doing something he had never done in his life, sitting in his office and not knowing something. For 11 years, whenever a question entered his mind, all he had odds to do was make one call, and 30 minutes later he had the answer. Now he had one very simple question. Was she all right? And he wasn't allowed to know. He couldn't sleep. On the 6th night, he got up at 2 o'clock in the morning and sat in the kitchen, and he knew exactly that it was 2 o'clock on Thursday morning, which meant she had just pulled down the metal shutter at that laundromat. He knew the road home took her through 3 traffic lights. He knew her car was old. He sat in the kitchen with all the things he knew, and he did nothing. He didn't text her either. He wrote a message 4 times, and deleted it all 4 times. His grandmother didn't ask him a single question. She only cooked more than usual and saved food for him. And one evening she said, "You're barely eating." And he said, "I'm not hungry." And she didn't say anything more. On the 8th day, Emil Vasco walked into his office and closed the door behind him. He didn't sit down. Nico was reading a contract. He didn't look up. Emil said, "Someone has been asking about her." Nico's pen stopped moving. He still didn't look up. "Where?" "At my workplace. Twice last week." They didn't ask directly. They circled around it. Things like, "What's keeping the young man so busy in South Philadelphia lately?" And things like, "Heard the old lady has company." Nico set down his pen. He remained still for 3 seconds. Then he stood, walked to the window, and spoke very quietly. "She's a teacher." Emil said nothing. "She teaches 4th grade in Kensington. She isn't part of this." He turned back to look at Emil. "And she never will be." He didn't shout. He didn't strike the desk. He didn't say a single sentence longer than 8 words. But Emil Vasco had worked with the Ranieri family since he was 23, and he knew how to read a man's voice. He gave one nod, then left the office. The next day, no one asked anymore. Nothing happened. No one was harmed. The question simply disappeared from every conversation in the city, and Marin never knew it had existed at all. That afternoon, Nico called Emil back in. He placed a thick file on the desk. Emil read the first page and looked up. "You plan to do this in 18 months, Nico said. "I'm cutting it to 9. Emil put the file down. "No," Nico said. "I've calculated it." Emil said, "You haven't calculated anything. You're rushing," Nico said. "I am rushing." Emil stepped closer to the desk. "Do you understand what this means? The board won't let you walk away without taking everything they believe they're owed. Shortening the timeline means you'll have to pay more, pay immediately, and pay with things you weren't ready to sell." Nico said, "I know." Emil said, "You don't know." Something in his voice broke open. Nico looked up at him. It was the first time in 11 years he had ever heard Emil Vasco raise his voice. The 58-year-old man stood there with both hands braced against the edge of the desk, and for 1 second there was something on his face that didn't look like opposition at all. It looked more like fear. He said, "Nicholas, listen to me. Don't do this fast." Nico asked, "Why?" Emil opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He straightened, adjusted his collar, and said, "I object. Put it in the record that I object." Then he walked out. Nico remained alone in the office. He stared at the closed door and knew that Emil Vasco had swallowed a sentence, and Nico didn't know what that sentence had been. It would take him much longer to find out. That evening was the 8th day. He went to his grandmother's house for dinner, and she asked, "Are you going to call the girl?" He said, "I made her a promise." She put down her fork. "You promised not to have anyone follow her. Did you promise you weren't allowed to call her?" Nico sat in silence. She continued, more softly this time. "You keep thinking those 2 things are the same. They aren't, child. It happened on the afternoon of the 7th day. She went out to the backyard to water the rose bushes, exactly the way the doctor had told her not to do alone. She bent down to turn on the faucet, then straightened up, and she stood a little too quickly. The neighbor on the other side of the fence was the first person to see her. Nico reached the hospital in 22 minutes. He had driven faster than that before in his life, but he had never driven that fast with his hands shaking. 2 days later, which made it the 9th day since the night Marin had stood on the threshold of his house. Her phone rang at 11:20 on Thursday morning. Unknown number. She was teaching, so she let it vibrate. It vibrated a second time. She apologized to the class and stepped into the hallway. "Hello?" On the other end was a young woman's voice, slightly hesitant. "I'm sorry. Are you the woman who was with Miss Rosalind at the bank the other day?" Marin said yes. "My name is Delia. I work at the Passyunk branch. I'm sorry to call out of nowhere. I had to ask several people before I could get your number." Marin leaned back against the wall. "What happened?" The young woman was quiet for a beat. "She's missed 2 Thursdays in a row." Marin couldn't say anything. "She normally comes at 11 o'clock. She sits in the waiting area. Last week I kept waiting, and I thought maybe she was busy. This week I waited until 11:15, and something didn't feel right. I don't have her number. I only remembered that you were with her that day." Marin heard herself say, Thank you so much." Then she hung up, and she stood there in the elementary school hallway, remembering what Rosalind had said on that stone bench. "Someone notices if I miss a Thursday." She had said it like a small reassurance to herself. It turned out to be true, and that truth had just saved her. Marin asked Miss Delaney to watch the class, grabbed her bag, and ran to her car. She called Nico for the first time in 9 days. He answered before the first ring had fully finished. "Where is she?" He gave her the name of the hospital. Marin had already started the car. The hospital was on the west side of the city. The doctor said Rosalind had orthostatic hypotension, meaning her blood pressure dropped suddenly when she changed position, along with a heart rhythm disorder she had already had but no one had detected before. He said she would be all right. He said they had implanted a pacemaker, a small device placed beneath the skin in the upper chest, and it would keep her heartbeat steady. He said she needed to rest for a few days and then she could go home. He added that it was fortunate she had been brought in early. Marin found Nico in the 4th floor hallway. He was sitting on a gray plastic chair, elbows on his knees, both hands holding his head. His coat was draped over the back of the chair beside him. He didn't see her coming. She sat down next to him and didn't say anything. A long time passed before he finally spoke, and he didn't lift his head. "The neighbor called me. Not me. Not one of my people. A 70-year-old woman on the other side of the fence." Marin still said nothing. Nico continued. "I have 42 people working for me. I know which car parks in front of my grandmother's house. I know what time her appointment is this week. I know how much the roofer quoted her last year." He stopped. "I didn't know my grandmother went into the yard on Saturday afternoon." He sat upright and stared at the wall in front of him. "I built an entire empire so my grandmother would be safe." He said the next sentence very softly. "The only thing she ever wanted was for me to sit down and have dinner." Somewhere at the far end of the hospital hallway, a cart rolled past. Marin didn't say anything. She didn't tell him it wasn't his fault. She didn't tell him he had done everything he could. She didn't say any of the things people usually say. She simply sat beside him. After a while, she reached over and rested her hand on the back of his, and he didn't pull away. They sat like that for nearly an hour. Late in the afternoon, a nurse came out and called for them. Rosalind was awake. Inside the hospital room, she was lying slightly on her side, her face still pale, her hair loosened from its bun. She saw the two of them come in and raised an eyebrow. "Oh," her voice was hoarse. "Both of you." Nico went to the bedside, and he couldn't say a word. She looked at him for a while, then turned toward Marin and pointed at her chest, where there was a bandage. "Do you know what they put in here?" Marin shook her head. "A machine, to remind my heart what it's supposed to do." She let out a breath. 79 years old, and I still need someone to remind me." Marin laughed, and when she did, her eyes filled with tears, forcing her to turn away. Nico sat down in the chair beside the bed. He took his grandmother's hand. He still didn't say anything. She left her hand resting in his, then looked out the window and said, her voice as light as though she were talking about the weather, "Nico." "Yes?" "I want to go downstairs to the basement." She came home on Tuesday afternoon. The doctor told her not to lift anything heavy for 3 weeks, not to raise her left arm above shoulder level, and absolutely not to do any gardening. She nodded through the entire lecture. The moment they reached the parking lot, she turned to Nico and asked how much a bag of fertilizer weighed. He said, "Grandma," she said, "I'm only asking." Marin laughed so hard she nearly dropped the bag of medicine. But on Thursday morning, Rosalind got up early and put on her finest wool coat. She called both of them over. When Marin walked into the kitchen, Rosalind was sitting at the table, and in front of her lay the small brass key, removed from its necklace. She pushed it toward Marin. "You hold this for me. My hands shake too much. I won't be able to open the lock." Then she looked at Nico. "I need you to come with me." He asked where. She said, "The bank." She didn't explain anything on the way. Nico asked twice, and both times she said, "You'll know soon enough." Marin sat in the back seat with the brass key resting in her palm, and it felt far heavier than an ordinary key had any right to feel. At the bank, Delia saw Rosalind and immediately jumped to her feet. "Ma'am," Rosalind raised one hand. "I'm fine. I was only gone for 2 weeks." The young woman came around the counter and hugged her, and Rosalind stood still and let herself be hugged, then patted Delia twice on the back. She said, "Thank you for calling." Delia said, "I just noticed you weren't here." Rosalind said, "I know." Then she said she wanted to go down to the basement. They were taken through a steel door, down a short flight of stairs, and into a room where all 4 walls were covered with small numbered metal compartments. The bank employee inserted the bank's key into one lock, then stepped back. The second lock belonged to the customer. Marin lifted the brass key. She looked at Rosalind. Rosalind nodded. Box number 214 was on the 3rd row from the bottom. The key fit perfectly. Marin turned it. There was a tiny click. She pulled out the long metal box and placed it on the table in the center of the room. The bank employee left and closed the door behind him. The 3 of them stood there. Rosalind said, "Open it." Nico reached out. He lifted the lid. There wasn't much inside. 4 photographs, their corners yellowed with age. A man's watch resting untouched in its original paper box, the leather strap still stiff, never worn, and an ivory-colored envelope. Nico picked up the watch first. He turned it over. On the back of the steel case were 2 words and a number engraved into the metal. Nico, 18. He went completely still. He held the watch in both hands as though he were afraid of dropping it. Then he set it down and picked up the envelope. Across the front was a handwritten line in slanting blue ink. "For my son. Read when you're old enough." Nico stared at the words for a long time. Then he turned toward his grandmother. She stood 2 steps away. One hand braced against the edge of the table. "That's Dad's handwriting." Rosalind said. "Yes," he asked. "Since when?" She didn't answer immediately. She pulled out the only chair in the room and sat down, sitting very straight, the way someone sits before saying something they have rehearsed silently for years. "6 weeks before your father died, he called me. He said, 'Mom, I left something for the boy at the bank. I rented a box, and I put your name on it with mine.' I asked him what he had left. He said, 'Don't ask.' He told me that when you turned 18, I was supposed to give it to you." In that windowless room, no one said anything. Marin could hear the air conditioning running somewhere above the ceiling. Nico remained motionless, the envelope still in his hand. He said very softly, "I'm 34 years old, Grandma." She said, "I know." Then she continued, and her voice began to break in the middle of the sentence. "He died, and then you were 11, and I had to raise you, and I thought I would wait until you were a little older. Then you turned 18. I picked up the transfer form and looked at the place where I had to sign, and I put it down. I put it in a drawer." She looked down at her 2 hands. "Then you were 20, then 25. Every year I told myself 1 more year wouldn't matter." Nico asked, "Why didn't you sign it?" She looked up at him and said the sentence that both of them would remember for a very long time. "Because as long as I hadn't signed it, somewhere in my mind there was still a box my son was keeping. No one had closed it. No one had finished dividing everything up. He was still leaving something there for you." She lifted a hand and wiped her eyes. "If I signed, I was admitting he was really gone." Nico set the envelope on the table. He walked over to her and lowered himself onto one knee in front of the chair, then took both of her trembling hands in his. She said, "I wasn't hiding it from you, Nico. I wasn't hiding it. I was keeping it." Then she continued, even more softly, "There are some things we don't have enough courage to take back." 16 years. She had been 16 years late, keeping a promise to her son. Marin stood with her back against the wall of metal boxes and didn't dare breathe too deeply. After a while, Nico stood. He picked up the envelope and looked at it, then looked at his grandmother. "Can I read it now?" She shook her head. "Don't read it here. Take it home. Our home." He read the letter in his grandmother's living room, sitting in the armchair where his grandfather used to sit. She made tea and then went upstairs to lie down, while Marin sat at the kitchen table, one doorway away, holding a student notebook she was supposed to be grading without managing to mark a single word. The letter was 4 pages long, handwritten in blue ink, the words slanting across the paper. Nico read slowly. At the end of the first page, he was still sitting upright. By the second page, he had leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, holding the paper in both hands. Halfway through the 3rd page, he stopped for a very long time at one line, and through the doorway, Marin saw his shoulders move once. He didn't make a sound. He only raised the back of his hand to his face once, very quickly, and then continued reading. In the letter, his father wrote about very small things. He wrote that he wasn't good at talking to his son because his own father had never really talked to him either. He wrote that many times he had stood outside the boy's bedroom door, intending to go in, only to turn away. He wrote that he was trying to change certain things about his work, and he didn't know whether he would have enough time to do it. Near the end of the 4th page, there was a passage underlined with a ruler, the ink noticeably darker, as though the man had put down his pen, picked up a ruler, and deliberately drawn the line beneath the words. If one day you meet a woman who makes you laugh before breakfast, don't make her wait. I made your mother wait. Don't let that happen in this house one more time. Nico read those lines 3 times. Then he folded the letter and held it against his chest. And he sat there like that for a very long time. The doorbell rang close to 8 o'clock that evening. Marin went to answer it. Emil Vasco stood outside without a coat, holding his hat in his hands. He asked whether Nico was home. Nico came to the door, and the 2 men looked at each other across the threshold. Emil said, "I need to talk." Now, they sat in the living room. Emil didn't waste time. He said, "I know you pulled your people away from the teacher." Nico said, "I did." Emil said, "I know, because I pulled out too." Nico looked up. Emil continued, "For the past 6 years, I'm the one who's been watching the old lady, not one of my men. Me." Nico sat completely still. 3 nights a week, I parked at the end of the street. In winter, I parked a little closer because I'm getting old, and it gets cold sitting out there too long. He looked down at the hat in his hands. "She knew," Nico said. "What?" Emil said. "She knew from the first winter. Every time the temperature dropped below freezing, she poured a cup of coffee, put 2 spoonfuls of sugar in it, carried it outside, left it on the covered step, then went back inside. She never looked toward the street once. She never waved. She never asked who I was. 6 years like that." In the kitchen, Marin lifted a hand to cover her mouth. Emil said, "I asked her once, 4 years ago. I asked why she knew and never told you." Nico asked, "What did she say?" Emil looked up. "She said if she told you, you'd be embarrassed. Then you'd pull your man away, and then you wouldn't have any way left to tell her you loved her. She told me to leave it alone." No one in the room said anything. Nico sat very still. Then Emil continued, and his voice changed. "Now I'm going to tell you why I fought your plan." Nico waited. "Because your father was planning to do exactly the same thing." Nico's head snapped up. 3 weeks before that night, he sat in the exact chair you're sitting in now and told me he was getting out. He had worked everything out. He told me to keep it quiet. Emil tightened his grip around the hat. "That night at the warehouse, I was supposed to be there. I had promised him 8 o'clock. I arrived at 9:15. He stopped. I wasn't there." Nico said his name. Emil raised one hand. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm only telling you so you understand why I've stood in your way for 11 years. It wasn't because of the money. It wasn't because of the board. It was because I already buried one Ranieri who wanted out, and I don't want to bury a second." He stood. He reached into his pocket, took out his office keys, and placed them on the table. "Go ahead with the 9 months. Shorten it. I won't stop you anymore. But you have to let me finish one thing." Nico asked, "What?" Emil said, "You take these. I've watched over the old lady for 6 years. Now it's your turn." He put on his hat and walked out. He didn't look back. Over the next 9 days, everything happened very quickly and very quietly. The board named its price, and that price had been decided long ago. There was no bargaining to be done. 60% of the transportation company Nico had spent 8 years building. He signed. He kept the name, retained control of the legitimate port operations, and made exactly one demand, one that wasn't open to negotiation. His grandmother and that teacher were outside all of it, forever. No one was to ask their names. No one was to park a car nearby. No one was to mention either of them in any room. The man at the head of the table looked at him for a moment, then nodded. That evening, the 3 of them ate dinner at his grandmother's house. She asked, "Is it finished?" Nico said, "It's finished, Grandma." She didn't ask how much he had lost. She only put more food into his bowl. In the middle of dinner, Marin's phone vibrated on the table. She picked it up and looked. An email. The subject line contained the name of an organization in Charlotte that she hadn't thought about for 8 months. She opened it. The candidate they had chosen had just withdrawn. 3 weeks later, at 7 o'clock in the morning, 30th Street Station was already crowded. Marin stood beneath the high vaulted ceiling in the middle of the concourse, a small suitcase resting beside her feet. Most of her belongings had already been sent ahead. The suitcase wasn't heavy. What was heavy was everything she was leaving behind. She heard the tap of a cane before she saw her. Rosalind came toward her wearing her finest wool coat, her hair pinned neatly into a bun, and behind her walked Nico carrying a paper bag. "Grandma, You didn't have to come all the way out here. Rosalind stopped in front of her and looked her over from head to toe. You think I'd let my favorite granddaughter leave without seeing her off? Marin smiled, and her eyes were already wet. I should have known. You should have. Rosalind opened her handbag, took out a cream-colored envelope, and handed it to her. Across the front were 2 handwritten words in trembling black ink. Resignation letter. Marin looked at it, then at Rosalind. I never worked for you. Of course you did. Open it. She opened the envelope. Inside was a sheet of paper carefully ruled into lines, every word written by hand. Employee name? Marin Aldridge. Position? Temporary granddaughter. Contract term due 5 minutes. Marin reached that line and had to stop. Rosalind said, Keep reading. Current status. Officially family. Forever. Resignation. Not permitted. Marin stood motionless in the middle of the station, holding the paper in both hands, and for about 10 seconds, she couldn't say anything. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Rosalind, holding her tightly, and Rosalind patted her twice on the back the way she always did. This is the best promotion I've ever had, Rosalind said. I made wedding dresses for 45 years. I know how to handle paperwork. An announcement sounded overhead. The train to Charlotte, platform number 6, 20 minutes until departure. Rosalind released her and stepped back, then turned to look at her grandson. Nico walked forward. He was no longer holding the paper bag. In his hand was his father's letter, folded carefully. The paper softened from having been opened so many times. He unfolded it to the final page and handed it to her. Beneath the line that had been underlined with a ruler, there was another sentence now, written in different ink, in different handwriting, with a ballpoint pen. Dad was right. Please don't make me wait anymore. Marin looked up at him. Nico spoke slowly, like a man who had practiced the words many times and still found them difficult. I'm not asking you to stay. She said nothing. That place is something you deserve. You applied for it. You were turned down. You worked 3 nights a week for 3 years to pay a debt you refused to let anyone else pay for you. I don't have the right to stand here and tell you to leave that behind. He paused. But before you get on that train, I need you to hear something. My whole life, I was taught that if you love someone, you stand far away from them. That's what the men in my family taught one another. My grandfather taught my father taught me, and not one of them ever said that word out loud even once. He looked toward Rosalind. I stood apart from my grandmother for 11 years and called it protection. I put someone at the end of her street for 6 years and convinced myself that meant I had done my duty. Rosalind stood there with one hand gripping the strap of her handbag, her eyes lowered toward the station floor. Nico turned back to Marin. I almost did the exact same thing to you. The day you told me not to have anyone follow you anymore, I kept my word. And then I sat in a house for 9 days without calling you once, telling myself it was respect. I was wrong. It was the old way with a different name. She still didn't say anything. He held out his hand, palm turned upward. I'm not asking whether you'll stay. I'm asking whether you'll give me the rest of my life to become worthy of those first 5 minutes. The announcement sounded a second time. Marin looked down at the hand he was offering. Then she looked at Rosalind. Then she said, Do you know what your grandmother said to me on the first day? He shook his head. She told me there are doors that only open when people believe they aren't alone. She placed her hand in his and closed her fingers around it. I don't want someone who makes me believe I'm not alone. I want someone who's actually standing there. Nico was silent for 3 seconds. Then he said, So that means yes? Marin smiled through her tears. It means I'm going. Only 9 months. That's what the contract says. And you're going to fly down every 2 weeks. No excuses about meetings. He said. All right, she said. I mean it. He said. So do I. Beside them, Rosalind turned her face away and pretended to study the departure board. In truth, she was wiping her eyes before either of them had a chance to notice. Marin hugged Nico. The crowd moved around them on both sides. Someone hurried past pulling a suitcase and bumped lightly against her shoulder, and she didn't notice. When she let go, she turned to Rosalind one last time. Grandma, remember to take your medicine tonight, Rosalind said. I'm 79 years old. I know, Rosalind said. I have a machine in my chest reminding me already. You don't need to remind me too. Marin laughed. She picked up her suitcase and started toward the ticket gate. After a few steps, she turned around. Both of them were still standing there. Rosalind raised one hand and waved. Nico didn't wave. He only stood there watching her. And he didn't take his eyes off her until she disappeared completely from sight. In the pocket of Marin's coat were 2 pieces of paper. One said that she was officially family and wasn't allowed to resign. The other was a letter written by a man who had died 23 years earlier, and at the very bottom was a sentence added in ballpoint pen that she had read so many times she knew it by heart. Charlotte turned out not to be as far away as Maren had imagined. Those 9 months passed in flights every 2 weeks, in video calls at 9 o'clock at night, and in Rosalind, learning how to hold the phone the right way around. She truly did learn, almost. Some evenings the screen still showed nothing but the kitchen ceiling, and Rosalind would keep talking normally for 4 full minutes before Maren finally managed to say, "Grandma, I'm talking to the light again." The work in Charlotte was better than she had imagined. She coordinated books and teachers for 14 schools, visited every one of them, and discovered that she was better at the job than she had ever dared to believe. During those 9 months, she paid $14,000 toward the debt. She paid off the rest 3 years later, on an April afternoon, and when the final receipt was placed in her hand, she went out to her car and sat there for 10 minutes without starting the engine. Then she called Rosalind. She called her before she called anyone else. She returned to Philadelphia to run a reading foundation for the city's public schools. The foundation was named the Wyatt Aldridge Foundation. At the first scholarship ceremony, the first person to step onto the stage was Milo Bracken. He carried a stack of papers fastened together with 3 staples and read a 4-page speech, most of which was about dinosaurs, with exactly 1 sentence at the end about how many books he had read since the day his school library received its new shelves. The entire auditorium applauded. In the front row, an elderly woman clapped louder than anyone else and told the person sitting beside her that the boy's ending was much better now than it used to be. Maren and Nico were married that summer in Rosalind's backyard, beneath the rose trellis that her late husband, Aldo, had planted 40 years earlier. The wedding was small, warm, filled with laughter. Exactly the kind of wedding Rosalind said he would have loved. She couldn't sew wedding dresses anymore because her hands trembled, but she sat beside the seamstress through 3 fittings and told her exactly where the dress needed to be let out. Then life returned to its ordinary rhythm. Sunday mornings, the 3 of them gathered around one table. Pancakes, coffee, far too much syrup. Rosalind still greeted Maren exactly the same way. "My favorite granddaughter is here." Nico would set down his coffee cup. "Grandma, she's my wife." Rosalind would spread butter over a slice of bread. "There's no difference." Maren would laugh and say, "I give up. I'm not arguing anymore." Rosalind would say, "You wouldn't win anyway." That afternoon, Maren walked into the small reading room in Rosalind's house and placed the brass key on the shelf. Beside it was the letter, softened from being folded and opened so many times, bearing the words of a father and the added line written by his son. Beside that was a new photograph, 3 faces standing close together, no longer connected by coincidence or by a 5-minute lie, but by choice. Sometimes family isn't what we are born with. It is what remains after the 5 minutes are over. Rosalind thought she was asking a stranger for only 5 minutes. She didn't know that those 5 minutes would heal an old and lonely heart, bring a man home before it was too late, and give a young woman who had once lost everything a place where she belonged. Life is always convincing us that there is still time. Time to make a phone call. Time to stop by and visit. Time to tell someone how much they matter to us. But tomorrow has never been guaranteed. And the words we save for later can become the words another person never gets to hear. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel to hear more compelling stories every day. Share it with someone you haven't called in a long time, because perhaps today they are waiting for exactly 5 minutes of your time. We would truly love to hear how you felt about today's story, what you thought of Rosalind, and whether, if you had been standing in line directly behind her that morning, you would have said yes. Leave a comment below so we can hear the deepest thoughts in your heart. We wish you and your family abundant health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.